The impossible strike. Captain Elena Vasquez gripped the controls of her aging atmospheric fighter as warning alarms screamed through the cockpit. The Korthax invasion fleet had broken through the outer defenses of Kepler 442b, and their armored convoy was rolling across the southern plains toward New Geneva, the planet's capital city. "Phoenix Squadron, this is command," crackled the voice of General Morrison through her helmet comm. "We need immediate air support on the Korthax ground convoy. Intel shows 35 heavy tanks and support vehicles moving through Sector 7. Elena's wingman, Lieutenant Torres, responded first. "Command, we're running on fumes here. Half our squadron is already down, and these old birds weren't built for this kind of punishment." The general's voice carried the weight of desperation. "I know what I'm asking, but those tanks reach the city in 2 hours, and we have 40,000 civilians who can't evacuate in time." Elena studied her tactical display. The convoy stretched across 3 kilometers of open grassland, protected by energy shields and anti-aircraft batteries. Standard military doctrine called for a full wing of heavy bombers to even attempt such a strike. She had 6 light fighters and enough ammunition for maybe 1 good pass. "Sir, with respect," Torres continued, "no aviator could strike that convoy and survive. It's suicide." Elena felt something cold settle in her stomach. She had been flying for 12 years since she was 18. She had seen 3 wars, lost more friends than she cared to count, and watched entire worlds burn. But she had never backed down from a fight when innocent lives hung in the balance. "Command, this is Phoenix Leader," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos around her. "Give me everything you have on that convoy's composition and defensive grid." "Elena, don't even think about it," Torres warned over the private channel. The data flooded her screens. 35 Korthax heavy assault tanks, each one the size of a small building and bristling with plasma cannons. 20 support vehicles carrying ammunition and shield generators. Anti-air coverage that could track and eliminate anything within 10 kilometers. She had faced Korthax forces before. They were methodical, predictable, and utterly ruthless. Their technology was superior to human equipment in almost every way. But they had one weakness that most humans never recognized. They thought in patterns, following predetermined tactical responses that had served them well across 100 conquered worlds. "Phoenix Leader, command. We're uploading the tactical package now. But Elena, I have to tell you, no one expects you to attempt this. The odds are—" "I've never been good at math anyway, sir," Elena interrupted, banking her fighter toward the coordinates. "Phoenix Squadron, form up on me. We're going in." "Elena, this is insane," Torres protested. "Even if we somehow break through their defenses, we don't have enough firepower to stop that many tanks." She smiled grimly, remembering her first instructor's words. "When you can't fight fair, fight smart. When you can't fight smart, fight dirty. When you can't fight dirty, fight like a human." "Torres, how long have you known me?" 5 years. But what does that have to do with— Have I ever led you into a situation we couldn't handle?" There was a pause. "Define handle." Despite everything, Elena laughed. "Fair point, but we're still here, aren't we?" The convoy came into view as they crested a low ridge. It was even more intimidating in person than the tactical display had suggested. The tanks moved in perfect formation, their dark hulls gleaming with energy shields, while scout drones circled overhead like mechanical vultures. "Phoenix Leader, this is Overwatch," came a new voice on the channel. "We're tracking your approach. You have maybe 60 seconds before they lock onto your formation." Elena studied the enemy formation, her mind racing. The Korthax always positioned their command tank in the center, surrounded by the heaviest armor. Their anti-air batteries were spaced evenly along the convoy's flanks, creating overlapping fields of fire that should have made any air attack impossible. Should have. But Elena had noticed something during her years of fighting the Korthax. For all their technological superiority, they relied heavily on automated systems. Their defensive protocols were sophisticated but inflexible. If you could confuse their targeting computers for even a few seconds, you could exploit gaps that a more adaptive enemy would never allow. Phoenix Squadron, listen carefully. We're not going to attack the convoy. What? Torres sounded confused. Then what are we doing? We're going to make them think we're attacking the convoy. There's a difference. She outlined her plan quickly. It was insane, desperate, and based on a theory about Korthak's tactical programming that she couldn't prove. But it was the only chance they had. You want us to what? Lieutenant Chang's voice climbed an octave. Elena, that's not tactics. That's barely organized suicide. Maybe. But 40,000 people are counting on us to try. The first missiles streaked toward them as Elena banked her fighter into a steep dive. Phoenix Squadron, execute pattern Delta 7. Remember, timing is everything. What happened next would be talked about in military academies for decades. Elena Vasquez, a human pilot flying a fighter that was already obsolete when she graduated from the academy, was about to attempt something that every tactical manual said was impossible. The Korthax convoy's defensive computers registered the incoming fighters and immediately activated standard anti-aircraft protocols. Targeting sensors locked onto the lead fighter and began tracking its approach vector. Energy weapons swiveled to intercept. But Elena wasn't flying where they expected her to fly. Instead of approaching the convoy head-on or from the flanks, she dove toward the rear guard, pulling up at the last second to skim just meters above the grassland. Her fighter's belly scraped the tops of the tall grass as she flew a path that no sane pilot would attempt, too low for most of the anti-air batteries to track effectively. Behind her, Torres and the rest of Phoenix Squadron spread out in what looked like a standard attack formation, drawing the convoy's attention and fire. Plasma bolts lit up the sky as the Korthax defenses opened up with everything they had. Elena's fighter screamed over the first line of tanks, so close that she could see the alien crews turning their weapons toward her. But she wasn't attacking them either. She was heading for something much more valuable. At the center of the convoy, protected by layers of armor and defensive shields, sat the command and control vehicle that coordinated the entire formation. It was a massive, heavily armored beast that served as the brain for the entire operation. But it had one vulnerability that Elena had discovered during the Battle of Cygnus Prime 3 years earlier. The Korthax command vehicles used a powerful communication array that had to be positioned above their defensive shields to maintain contact with their fleet in orbit. For a few crucial seconds during transmission bursts, that array was exposed. Elena had been waiting for 12 minutes for the next scheduled communication window. According to her intelligence briefing, it should happen in 15 seconds. 10 seconds. She armed her last 2 anti-tank missiles and locked onto the command vehicle's communication array. 5 seconds. Plasma fire erupted around her fighter as the convoy's defenses finally adjusted to her unexpected approach angle. 3 seconds. Warning lights flashed across her instrument panel as her fighter took hits from multiple sources. 1 second. The communication array extended above the command vehicle's shields, just as Elena had predicted. She fired both missiles and pulled up hard, her fighter climbing almost vertically as every weapon in the convoy opened fire on her position. The sky around her turned into a storm of energy bolts and explosions. The missiles struck the communication array with surgical precision, sending a cascade of sparks and debris across the command vehicle's hull. For a moment, nothing else happened. Then Elena smiled as she saw exactly what she had been hoping for. The convoy's perfect formation began to waver. Without their central command and control system, the individual Korthax tank crews were falling back on their basic programming. But those programs weren't designed for the kind of low-level, high-speed attack that Elena had just demonstrated. They were written for conventional warfare against conventional enemies. They had never been designed to fight someone crazy enough to attack a heavily defended convoy with 6 obsolete fighters and a plan that belonged in a fever dream. Elena's fighter climbed through a hail of fire, her hull scarred and smoking, but still flying. Behind her, the Korthax convoy was beginning to show the first signs of the chaos she was about to unleash. "Phoenix leader to command," she called, as plasma bolts continued to streak past her canopy. "Phase 1 complete. Beginning Phase 2. "Elena, your fighter is badly damaged," Torres called out. "Your port engine is smoking and I can see hull breaches." "I know," Elena replied calmly. "But we're not done yet." She banked her wounded fighter around for another pass, this time from a completely different angle. The Korthax crews would be trying to adapt their defensive patterns to counter her unconventional approach, but Elena was betting that their rigid tactical programming would make them predictable. She had 34 more tanks to deal with and very little time to do it. The chain reaction. Elena's damaged fighters screamed through the smoke and fire as she began her second attack run. The Korthax convoy was no longer the perfectly ordered formation it had been moments before. Without their command vehicle's central coordination, individual tank crews were making their own tactical decisions, and those decisions weren't coordinated with their neighbors. "Phoenix Squadron, you seeing this?" Elena called out, as she watched 3 Korthax tanks turn their main guns toward her position, while 2 others continued tracking Torres's fighter. "Their formation is breaking down. I see it, but I don't understand it," Torres replied, diving to avoid a stream of plasma fire. "They're still shooting at us with everything they have." Elena smiled grimly as she armed her remaining weapons. She only had her fighter's twin pulse cannons now, hardly enough to scratch the paint on a Korthax heavy tank under normal circumstances. But these weren't normal circumstances. "That's exactly the point, Torres. They're shooting, but they're not thinking." She had studied Korthax tactical doctrine for years after the disaster at Proxima Station, where an entire human fleet had been destroyed by just 12 Korthax cruisers. The alien strength came from their ability to coordinate massive formations with clockwork precision, each unit supporting every other unit in a web of interlocking defenses. But that coordination depended on constant communication between individual commanders and their central tactical computer. Elena hadn't just knocked out their communications array. She had forced them to revert to autonomous operation protocols that were designed for individual survival, not coordinated warfare. The convoy's lead tank fired its main gun at Elena's fighter, missing by less than 50 meters. The plasma bolt continued past her and struck a rocky outcropping, sending debris flying in all directions. Some of that debris struck the tank immediately behind the leader, triggering its automatic defense systems. That tank's computers identified the debris as incoming projectiles and responded according to standard protocols, by firing on the source of the threat, which, from its perspective, was the tank in front of it. The second tank's plasma bolt struck the first tank's rear armor, causing minor damage, but triggering a cascade of automated responses throughout the convoy. Suddenly, Korthax tanks were identifying each other as potential threats and adjusting their defensive postures accordingly. "Elena, are they shooting at each other?" Chang's voice crackled over the comm channel. "Not yet," Elena replied, lining up her next target. "But they're about to be." She dove toward a tank on the convoy's eastern flank, one that had positioned itself to cover the formation's vulnerable side. Her pulse cannons fired continuously as she approached, the energy bolts sparking harmlessly off the tank's shields. But Elena wasn't trying to damage the tank. She was trying to make it panic. The Korthax tank's defensive computer registered the incoming fire and calculated the optimal response. According to its programming, the logical action was to eliminate the threat while minimizing exposure to additional attacks. That meant turning to present its heaviest armor toward Elena's fighter. But when the tank turned, it blocked the firing line of 2 other tanks that had been tracking Elena's wingman. Those tanks' computers immediately flagged the first tank as an obstruction and began calculating new firing solutions. Elena pulled up sharply, her fighter's damaged engines screaming in protest. Behind her, 3 Korthax tanks were now pointing their weapons at each other instead of at the human fighters. "Phoenix Leader, this is incredible," Torres called out. "Tank number 7 just fired on tank number 12. They're actually fighting each other." "Only the beginning," Elena replied, banking toward her next target. "Korthax tactical AI is designed to optimize for maximum battlefield efficiency. But when you disrupt their command structure, those same algorithms become a liability." She was exploiting something that human military theorists had argued about for decades: the difference between intelligence and adaptability. The Korthax had superior technology and computational power, but they had become so dependent on their automated systems that they couldn't adapt to truly unexpected situations. A human tank crew, faced with friendly fire, would use judgment and communication to resolve the situation. Korthax tanks relied on programmed responses that assumed perfect information and centralized coordination. Elena's fighter swept over the convoy again, this time targeting the ammunition carriers. She couldn't destroy them with her light weapons, but she could make them think they were under heavy attack. The carriers immediately moved to protective positions behind the heavy tanks, disrupting the convoy's defensive formation even further. The domino effect was accelerating. Tanks were moving out of position to track targets, blocking each other's firing lines and triggering additional defensive responses. 3 more Korthax vehicles had opened fire on each other, and the convoy's neat formation was dissolving into chaos. "Phoenix Squadron, reform on me," Elena ordered. "We're going to help this process along." She had realized something during the first few minutes of the battle. The Korthax convoy wasn't just a collection of individual tanks. It was a complex system with multiple interdependent components. Disrupt enough of those components, and the entire system would collapse. But she needed to be surgical about it. Random attacks would eventually allow the Korthax computers to adapt and restore coordination. She had to target specific vehicles in a specific sequence to maximize the cascade failure. "Torres, take Chang and hit the eastern flank scouts. Don't try to destroy them, just keep them moving." "Copy that. What about you?" Elena studied her tactical display, watching the convoy's formation continue to degrade. Tank number 14 had just fired on tank number 21 after a targeting computer glitch identified it as a hostile. Tank number 21 had responded by designating 14 as a priority threat. "I'm going after the shield generators." The Korthax convoy relied on mobile shield generators to protect their vehicles from orbital bombardment. Those generators were positioned throughout the formation, creating overlapping protective fields that could deflect most attacks. But the shield generators had to communicate constantly with each other to maintain those overlapping fields. And Elena had just given her a way to turn that communication against them. She dove toward the lead shield generator, a squat, heavily armored vehicle bristling with defensive weapons. Her pulse cannons fired in rapid succession, not at the generator itself, but at the communication dishes mounted on its hull. The dishes sparked and went dark. Immediately, the other shield generators in the convoy detected the loss of communication and began adjusting their field patterns to compensate. But those adjustments required them to shift position, which meant moving out of their assigned spots in the formation. More chaos, more confusion, more opportunities for the Korthax computers to misidentify targets and make mistakes. Elena's fighter took a hit from a tank's secondary weapons, sending her spinning through a cloud of her own debris. Warning lights flashed across her instrument panel as she fought to regain control. "Elena, you've lost your port stabilizer," Torres called out. "Your fighter is barely holding together." "Still flying?" "Still fighting," Elena replied through gritted teeth. She had managed to stop the spin, but her fighter was handling like a brick with wings. The convoy was now in complete disarray. Tanks were firing in all directions, some at the human fighters but others at each other. The formation had stretched out over nearly 5 kilometers as individual vehicles took evasive action or moved to what their computers calculated as more defensible positions. But Elena wasn't finished. She had identified the convoy's remaining command elements, the secondary control vehicles that were trying to restore order to the chaos. If she could eliminate them, the cascade failure would become irreversible. "Phoenix Squadron, final push," she called out. "Target the vehicles with the tall antenna arrays. Those are their backup command units." Her fighter dove toward the nearest secondary command vehicle, plasma fire erupting around her as every weapon in the convoy that could track her opened fire. Her damaged engines were overheating, and she could smell smoke in the cockpit. She fired her pulse cannons at the command vehicle's antenna array, watching the metal structure collapse in a shower of sparks. The vehicle immediately lost contact with its assigned tank units, which began reverting to autonomous defensive protocols. 1 down, 2 to go. Elena pulled up hard, her fighter groaning under the stress. Her port engine was throwing black smoke now, and her starboard engine was running rough. She had maybe one more attack run left before her fighter fell apart completely. "Elena, eject!" Torres called out urgently. "Your fighter is going to explode." She looked at her instrument panel. Torres was right. Her fighter was dying, multiple systems failing simultaneously. But there were still 2 command vehicles active, and 40,000 people in New Geneva who were counting on her to stop this convoy. "Negative, Torres. Not finished yet." Elena banked her disintegrating fighter toward the second command vehicle, using the last of her ammunition to destroy its communication systems. The explosion sent her fighter tumbling through the air, alarms screaming as more systems failed. 1 command vehicle left, and she was out of weapons. But Elena Vasquez had been flying dangerous missions for 12 years, and she had learned that sometimes the most effective weapon was the fighter itself. She pointed her dying aircraft at the last command vehicle and pushed the throttles forward, committing to a ramming attack that would either save 40,000 lives or add her name to the list of pilots who had died trying. The convoy's defensive fire intensified as the Corthax computers recognized her intent. But Elena's fighter was too damaged to maneuver effectively anyway. She held her course, her hands steady on the controls as plasma bolts streaked past her canopy. The last thing she saw before impact was the expression of pure shock on the face of the Corthax commander, visible through the command vehicle's armored viewport. Even alien faces, apparently, could show surprise when a human did something completely insane. Victory from the ashes. Elena's fighter struck the Corthax command vehicle with the force of a meteor, the impact sending a shockwave across the battlefield. The explosion was visible for kilometers, a brilliant orange fireball that marked the end of the convoy's last hope for coordinated defense. For several long seconds, nobody moved. The remaining Corthax tanks sat motionless in the grassland, their computer systems frantically trying to process what had just happened. In their databases of tactical scenarios, there was no entry for enemy pilot deliberately rams command vehicle with damaged fighter. Torres pulled his fighter out of a desperate evasive maneuver and stared at the expanding cloud of debris where Elena's aircraft had been. "Phoenix leader, respond. Elena, please respond." Silence filled the communication channel. On the ground, the Corthax convoy was experiencing a complete systemic failure. With all command and control elements destroyed, individual tank crews were falling back on the most basic autonomous protocols: survive and eliminate immediate threats. But without coordination, they couldn't distinguish between legitimate targets and friendly forces that happened to be in the wrong position. Tank 14, already damaged from friendly fire, identified Tank 21 as the source of previous attacks and opened fire with its main gun. Tank 21 responded by targeting 14, and within moments, both vehicles were engaged in a deadly duel that had nothing to do with the human fighters overhead. The ammunition carriers, programmed to retreat from combat zones, began moving away from the fighting tanks. but their movement triggered defensive responses from other vehicles, which interpreted the retreat as a potential flanking maneuver by enemy forces. Within 10 minutes of Elena's sacrifice, the Korthax convoy had effectively destroyed itself. Tanks fired on ammunition carriers, shield generators targeted tanks, and support vehicles fled in random directions as their computer systems tried to implement contradictory defensive protocols. Torres watched in amazement as the most feared ground formation in the Korthax military disintegrated before his eyes. "Command, this is Phoenix 2. The convoy has stopped advancing. Repeat, the convoy has stopped advancing and is engaging in fratricidal fire." "Phoenix 2, confirm your last transmission." General Morrison's voice crackled through the comm system. "Are you saying they're fighting each other?" "Affirmative, Command. Estimate 70% of the convoy is either destroyed or disabled. The remainder appears to be retreating in disorder." Torres pulled his fighter into a wide circle around the battlefield, hardly believing what he was seeing. 35 Korthax heavy tanks, the spearhead of an invasion force that had conquered a dozen worlds, had been reduced to smoking scrap metal and confused stragglers by a single human pilot flying an obsolete fighter. But the cost had been enormous. "Command, Phoenix leader is down. Captain Vasquez did not survive her attack run." The words hung in the air like a physical weight. Elena had been more than just a squadron leader. She had been the kind of pilot that others measured themselves against, the standard for courage and skill that seemed impossible to match. "Understood, Phoenix 2. All units, be advised that Captain Elena Vasquez has given her life to stop the Korthax ground assault. New Geneva is safe." As Torres flew over the wreckage of the convoy, he began to understand the full scope of what Elena had accomplished. It wasn't just that she had destroyed 35 enemy tanks. It was how she had done it that would change everything. For years, human forces had fought the Korthax using conventional tactics, trying to match their superior technology with superior numbers or better strategy. They had accepted that Korthax forces were more advanced, more coordinated, and more deadly than anything humanity could field. Elena had proved that assumption wrong. She had shown that the Korthax dependence on automated systems wasn't a strength. It was a critical vulnerability that could be exploited by anyone crazy enough to try. The wreckage of Elena's fighter lay scattered across 100 meters of grassland, mixed with the debris from the Korthax command vehicle. Torres dropped his fighter to a low altitude and flew slowly over the crash site, looking for any sign that Elena might have survived. He found nothing recognizable. The impact had been too violent, the explosion too complete. But as he pulled up from his search pattern, Torres noticed something that made him smile despite his grief. The Korthax tanks that were still functional had stopped fighting each other and were now retreating toward their original landing zone. Their computer systems had finally adapted to the loss of central command, but the damage was done. The convoy that had been unstoppable an hour earlier was now a scattered collection of damaged vehicles limping home in defeat. 3 days later, the story of Elena's attack was being transmitted across human space. Military analysts studied the tactical recordings, trying to understand how a single pilot had achieved what entire fleets had failed to accomplish. The answer, when they finally understood it, was both simple and profound. Elena hadn't won through superior firepower or advanced technology. She had won by thinking like a human instead of like a computer. The Korthax had conquered 12 worlds using the same tactical doctrine, overwhelming force applied with perfect coordination. Their computer systems were programmed to counter every known military strategy, every conventional attack pattern, every standard defensive formation. But Elena hadn't used any of those. Instead, she had exploited the one weakness that the Korthax had never considered, their own reliance on artificial intelligence. By disrupting their command and control systems at precisely the right moments, she had turned the convoy's greatest strength, its coordination, into its greatest weakness. The same algorithms that made Korthak's forces so effective in coordinated warfare became liabilities when that coordination broke down. The implications were staggering. If Elena's tactics could be replicated and refined, humanity might finally have found a way to fight the Korthaks on equal terms. But perhaps more importantly, Elena had proved something that military theorists had been arguing about for centuries, that human intuition, creativity, and willingness to take insane risks could still triumph over superior technology and computational power. Within a month, every human military academy was teaching courses on Vasquez-style asymmetric warfare. Fighter pilots across human space were studying her attack patterns, learning to think beyond conventional tactics, and embrace the kind of creative chaos that could confuse enemy computer systems. The Korthaks, for their part, began upgrading their tactical software to account for irrational human behavior. But they faced a fundamental problem. How do you program a computer to predict actions that are inherently unpredictable? Elena Vasquez had died in the cockpit of an obsolete fighter, armed with nothing but pulse cannons and an impossible plan. But her legacy would outlive the war itself. Years later, when historians wrote about the turning point in the human Korthaks War, they would point to the Battle of New Geneva as the moment when humanity stopped trying to fight like machines and started fighting like humans. And in the center of New Geneva, where 40,000 people lived because of Elena's sacrifice, a monument was erected with a simple inscription. She showed them that impossible is just another word for human. Torres, now a general himself, stood at that monument 5 years after the battle, watching a new generation of pilots graduate from the academy. They wore patches on their uniforms that showed a stylized fighter diving toward a tank, with the words, "Think human," emblazoned underneath. Elena would have laughed at the formality of it all. She had never wanted to be remembered as a hero or a legend. She had just wanted to save lives and do her job. But as Torres watched the young pilots file past the monument, each one pausing to read the inscription, he knew that Elena's real victory hadn't been destroying 35 enemy tanks. It had been proving that being human, with all the crazy, irrational, impossible things that entailed, was still worth something in a galaxy full of computers and algorithms. The Korthaks had learned to fear human unpredictability, and that fear, more than any weapon or strategy, had changed the course of the war. Elena Vasquez had been told that no aviator could strike that convoy and survive. She had proved them half right. No aviator could strike that convoy and survive. But she had also proved that sometimes survival wasn't the point. Sometimes the impossible was exactly what the universe needed.